I'm just going to set aside the agenda. I'm just going to change the minutes and you ready, Erica, to start it? Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all for being here tonight. We'll call to order the October 5th, 2022 meeting to order. It's 5:30. Acceptance of the agenda. We won't be doing the approval of the minutes. We'll add those to next week's agenda. So number 1 there. And then number 3A on finance. If we get to that earlier than say 6:30, we might move that to a later time because they're going to be coming on later. So those are the only 2 changes. Announcements, Libby?
This meeting is being video and audio recorded. Mark your calendars. The 2023 annual town meeting will start on Saturday, May 6th. The warrant is currently open for citizen warrant article submittals until November 14th at 4. Town offices will be closed this coming Monday, October 10th, in observance of Indigenous Peoples Day. And I wanted to introduce and welcome Michael Cranston, our new fire chief. He is present. And he's going to come up to the mic and introduce himself. And as we know, there was a large fire last weekend, just before Chief Cranston arrived on island. We are very appreciative and thank the fire department for their efforts to extinguish the fire and prevent it from spreading. And Chief, I don't know if you have any updates about the cause of the fire or any other details about it that you wanted to mention, and any other introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you, Libby.
Thank you.
Good evening, Select Board, public. My name's Mike Cranston. I am the new fire chief. As the town manager stated, we did have a fire Saturday morning early around 3:30 a.m. I was in a very large residential structure. The owner of the building was staying in a nearby beach cottage. He was alerted to the fire by his dog. Subsequently, he called 911, and fortunately, we had a couple of firefighters out in an engine already returning from a call. They were able to respond, and it was a lengthy process. It was a very large home. There was a tremendous amount of wind and other challenges that were faced by the firefighters, but everybody pulled together and did a fantastic job of preventing the fire from spreading to neighboring structures, tracking down some embers that had started to ignite on some rooftops, and received a ton of assistance from other both outside agencies, other fire departments from the mainland, as well as the Coast Guard, members of the land bank, the airport, the sewer department. I don't want us to miss anybody, but there's a tremendous amount of help, as well as from public citizens. So we're certainly very appreciative of that. The fire is still under investigation, the cause of the fire, and that's being handled through the fire department investigation unit, as well as the Nantucket Police Department as well. So I don't have anything to update on as far as the cause of the fire, but it is under investigation. Also, on a separate note, I would just like to say thank you for having me here. I'm excited to be here. I arrived Saturday afternoon with my wife. I'm sorry I didn't bring better weather, but I'm hoping that it improves by this weekend. So I've hit the ground running at the fire department. I will say I've been meeting with all the firefighters individually, and everybody, I've been thoroughly impressed with both the professionalism and the knowledge that each member has, but also the fact that they have all been super gracious in welcoming me to the department. And so I certainly appreciate that. We do have a few things that we're going to start looking at. Where I know we've already started budget season, so we're sort of hitting the ground running with that, getting up to speed on where we are through the first quarter of this budget cycle, as well as getting ready for the fiscal 24 budget. Also, we do have a meeting planned with all the firefighters, and we've invited the dispatchers as well to go over the fire the other night, find out what went well, what we can do maybe to make things better next time, and to just share some knowledge with each other about what exactly happened, and the effort and the emphasis is on making us better. So that's the plan coming up. We also have an officers meeting planned to sort of make sure we're all on the same page. I may be the fire chief, but we are a team. And so we will build consensus and do our very best to move the department forward as far as what our capabilities are, what we can do. We'll be looking at everything. We will be looking at staffing, as well as any other thing that we think would make the department perform better for the public. And I'm happy, I'll be here for the meeting. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to grab me now or after the meeting, and I'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief.
Thanks very much, Chief. That is all I had for announcements.
Okay. Any beginning select board announcements or comments? Okay. There's no follow-up on comments from prior select board meetings. Is there any public comment tonight on items or subject matter that's not on the agenda? Yes, go ahead.
My name is Mary Chalk, and I live year-round at 7D Street. This island has been the enemy of the whales for hundreds of years. First, Nantucketers killed the North Atlantic right whales for their oil to light our lamps. Now, we are trading the lives of whales for electricity to light our homes. And worse, the town is taking cash payments from the wind companies and are looking the other way as the wind companies Avangrid, Ørsted, and Shell seek and obtain permits from NOAA fisheries to disturb, injure, or kill up to 24 whales when necessary during construction. We should, out of obligation to the whales, since our island led the way in slaughtering them for profit, be the first to stand up for the 330 who are left. We should be guardians of the remnants who seek refuge off our shore. Vineyard Wind's own impact statement admits the offshore wind developments on the East Coast, including Vineyard Wind, will have little significant impact on global warming. So we can return Vineyard Wind's money and start standing up to lead the nation in the fight to save our right whales from extinction. We owe this to the North Atlantic right whale.
Thank you, Mary. Can we go to Mary Lepre online?
Hi, it's Mary Lepre. I just have a couple of questions. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Mary.
So I'm not sure why when we had the fire on Saturday, there was no social media update, and it really wasn't, I don't think, until today. With the Veranda House fire, I feel like the social media updates were every 5 minutes, and this seemed like it was also a very significant fire. I also have a question. Why we're having the new chief who wasn't even the chief on Saturday during the fire, speaking on a fire that he wasn't at, and it's very nice for him to give a report, but why aren't you asking people who were there? I mean, there were 11 firefighters there, and I'm not sure why you weren't asking any of them to give a report when they were the ones there. Wouldn't it be better to get a report from a primary source? That's it.
Thank you, Mary. Is there any other public comment here tonight, here or online, for items not on the agenda? Okay, always give it a couple seconds, make sure with digital hands, you're ready to raise. Okay, we'll move on. There's no new business that I know of. We're going to skip over minutes. Is there a motion to approve payroll warrants and treasury warrants?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye, that passes 4-0. And pending contracts, Libby, you wanted to go over a couple things?
I did, yes. Some of these are projects that have been either ongoing for a while or are going to be kind of significant. So there's just 3 contracts on here, but the first one is an amendment to an existing contract that will enable exterior repairs and the replacement of windows at the town building at 16 Broad Street, 20 South Water Street, and 1 East Chestnut Street. And I mention this only because this is most likely going to be a costly project in light of current conditions with supply chain and material costs and labor costs. And this amendment is to seek professional cost estimating as to to try to pin down a firmer estimated cost of the project. And I'm really just mentioning it to you because we already expect this project to cost in excess of $1 million. And if it reaches 1.5, we are going to need to engage an owner's project manager, which for a project like this would be costly, more costly than, well, probably not more costly than the funding we have, but the funding we have is coming from an appropriation for facilities that was appropriated a couple of years ago. We have a borrowing authorization of $6 million for various facility improvements, and we're just concerned that this could really eat into that if we have to hire an owner's project manager. So I'm just letting you know that. Secondly, is additional design services for what we're calling here Raceway Drive Stormwater Improvement Project, including alignment and stormwater design. This is a project that has experienced what we sometimes call scope creep. And it started out as a stormwater project believed to be fairly straightforward on Somerset Road. And it now, due to other realizations, I guess, it is now expanding down to Raceway, and not only is it a stormwater project, it's now an intersection improvement project and has necessitated the need for the acquisition of some private property for the stormwater and possibly the intersection improvement. So we've had a little bit of inquiry about this from time to time as to why this project hasn't gotten off the ground, and it's because it keeps expanding. And there's a reason why you want to do everything at one time. But just so you know,
It's like open up a wall, think you're just going to fix one little drywall
Exactly.
patch. And
Yep, and then pretty soon it's the
Yeah,
whole
it's the whole
room,
house.
and then, yeah. And lastly is a $42,000 contract with Wesson and Sampson for design, engineering, and permitting services for another project that isn't really scope creep exactly, but it's more the sort of collision of 2 projects that make sense to combine. One of which is to remove debris that is underneath and way back in the bluff at Tom Nevers Park. Some of it, as we have seen, is coming out of the bluff when there are storms in that area. And we have engaged professional services to determine just how far back does it go. Well, we've done some ground penetrating radar analysis, and it goes pretty far back. And while all that was going on, we finished our coastal resiliency plan, which has a recommended project in there for coastal resiliency. I think it's a berm-like structure out at Tom Nevers Bluff. And so we were thinking we should do those at the same time. And so that is what this funding is for. Just wanted to explain.
I just wanted to comment. I think, for many years, we've talked about making sure that we combined things for efficiency. And even though it sometimes takes a little bit longer and is more costly all at once, I like to see it.
Yeah,
That's
thank you.
all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I agree, Don, to halfway fix the Raceway problem, right? Rather take another 6 months or a year and fix it all the way. Thank you, Libby. Any questions on pending contracts, comments? Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That passes unanimously, 4-0. Consent items, gift acceptance for human services and planning and land use services. So I don't have that in front of me. Does anybody have it in front of me? They can read it, what it is?
I do, if you want.
Go ahead. Thank you.
There was one gift for the Saltmarsh Senior Center from Jill Johnson in the amount of $500. And then for the Planning and Land Use Services Office, it was a gift of $4,000 from Tyler and Aaron Thurston to be utilized for pedestrian and bike path improvements.
Thank you, Erica. Is there a motion to approve
Motion
with
to-
letter of thanks?
Yes. So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, that passes 4-0. Next up, Citizen Department Committee request for acceptance of a monetary gift from Sconjabe's SPPF in connection with costs for engineering and consulting services for compliance plan and notice of intent NOI for erosion control project.
So just a little background on this. I might need to be supplemented by our Coastal Resiliency Coordinator, Vince Murphy, who is present. This gift is kind of a supplement to an existing contract that we have with Arcadis Consulting that the board approved in January with the acceptance of a gift in December. So I should say that the other way around. The board accepted a gift in December of 2021 from SBPF for the funding of a subsequent contract with Arcadis to develop a joint notice of intent to the Conservation Commission for the erosion control, expansion of the erosion control project in Wisconsin along Baxter Road. Long story short, although Vince can elaborate if need be, as we've progressed down that road, a number of things have happened, and we actually need additional funds to complete the NOI as well as a compliance plan, and that is going to cost an estimated $95,000, which is forthcoming from SBPF, and we have engaged our own engineering firm that SBPF is funding so that the town's interest can be protected and the project can be underway under our supervision, at least partially. Anything else, Vince, that I missed or that you want to add?
Very little to add to that, lovely and succinct. Just to say that there was a lot of work that went into preparing this and getting it to this stage. We've had one or two setbacks along the way. We're now in an extremely good position with where we are and with SBPF, and with a way to move forward with what could well prove to be a very valuable piece of infrastructure for the community at large and protection of the general area.
Thanks, Vince. Any questions?
Just a comment. There were some questions from the public, and Vince was good enough, I think, to send out a response today. And there was some concerns about, which pocket was this from, and was it part of the scope, et cetera. And I think he looked through it and answered all that today. So thank you, Vince.
Okay, is there a motion to approve this gift?
Motion to approve.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, that passes 4-0. Next up.
I'm going to recuse from this.
Sorry?
I'm just going to recuse.
Okay, Don's going to recuse here. Request for rescission of select board vote on July 20th, 2002 to accept an easement from Bluefin Partners on Ellen's Way. And I think we have Jesse Bell on from the land bank. Are you going to take it?
I'll start it out.
Okay.
I'm a fill-in on this item because Ken wasn't able to be here for it, but Jesse, you can help me with it if I'm not quite saying it correctly. In July, the board accepted an easement from Bluefin Partners LLC, which is the trustee of Ellen's Way Homeowners Association. And it came to light later that there were some obligations that went along with that weren't initially clear. And that necessitated or triggered a discussion with the land bank about that. And since then, there's been some meetings between the land bank, the town, and Bluefin Partners, the end result of which is that a new 5-foot wide access strip to the property will be granted in lieu of the previously granted easement. And the land bank has agreed to create and then permanently maintain the easement. So the request is that the board rescind its vote from July 2022. And that's it, because Jesse, correct me if I'm wrong, but the land bank, it takes it from here.
Make a motion to rescind our vote from July.
A second.
Any other discussion? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Erica?
Can you also make a motion to submit the letter as
And,
well?
yeah, and make a motion, to submit the letter.
Okay, thank you.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That also passes.
And I think we did have questions that night, and we thought they were answered, but they weren't fully answered. So it's good to have it corrected in the right way. So,
Thanks, Matt. Okay, we'll move on to number 3, finance. We're going to skip over A, then we'll get to that at 6:30 or after. So B is request for approval of a general obligation bond sale. We have Mr. Turbot here.
Sorry about that.
Good entrance.
I know, right? So the first request before you is a request for the approval of general obligation bonds. There were 2 series. I do want to take one moment and apologize. There's a reference to a 1.5% net coupon that did not occur in this sale. I apologize if that was left in there. The first being a tax exempt series, there were 5 bidders. The award was made to Fidelity Capital Markets. Total interest on the tax exempt debt was 3.913. Series B, which is was for affordable housing, is similar to Series A. There were 2 bidders on the taxable offering in the amount of $3,750,000. Again, Fidelity Capital Markets was awarded that with the total interest cost of 4.866, which for general obligate, both for permanent and short-term debt, we're certainly seeing a very changing environment, which when Cinder is able to get on, she's going to explain a little bit more what she's seeing, but we're getting into a period where I think we're going to slow down some of the pursuit of borrowing because the rates are getting to be very high.
Brian, what would that number have been 3 years ago? 4.8 to,
the tax exempt offering probably would have been under 3, and the taxable probably would have been close to 3 or a little closer to 3.5. So we're certainly seeing the effects of the rising interest rates and the moves that the Feds have made. So that's the first part of the AIS and the first note to approve the permanent bond sale in for those 2 series. Do you have the vote all at one, Erica? Do you know? It is? Okay, so then I'll take them all through them at the same time. Okay. So the second part of that was a band sale in the amount of $13,442,000, which will continue to fund the sewer force main. It'll continue to fund various airport projects and continue to fund some short-term work for the affordable housing. There were 5 bidders participating in this. Again, Fidelity Capital Markets was awarded the bid, which with a total interest cost of 3.2287%. And back a year and a half ago, we were getting low 2s with our total interest costs. So we're seeing the effects across all of the markets right now. And the last piece of this was a grant anticipation note. We're still working with finalization with Chapter 90 for some of the projects that have been approved and are recently completed in the amount of $875,000. And that bid was again to Fidelity Capital Markets. They actually had a clean sweep this time. Normally they don't come in quite as good. And the total interest cost of 4.2356%, which again was substantially higher than I've seen grant anticipation notes in a long time. So we would ask for favorable approval of all of those bond sales.
so that's B, C, and D.
Yes, that's correct.
And just a reminder, your motion should say that you move to approve the vote that's in your packet dated October 5th, 2022.
Somebody got that?
Move to approve the vote
That's in the packet.
in the
Or-
packet, October
15th.
5th, 2022.
Oh, yeah, today.
Second.
Not 10 days from now. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That passes 4-0.
Thank you very much.
Brian, do you want to introduce the auditor?
Are we going to E now, the CAFR?
We're going to the review of the 2021 we're going to a review of the fiscal 2021 audit, and there is a PowerPoint presentation.
Great.
I'd like to introduce Tony Roselli from the audit firm of Roselli, Clark & Associates, here to give you a brief overview of the audit from fiscal 21 and a brief overview of the management letter observations, which I will note were not, they were actually not bad. They were carryovers, which we are working on, but I'll let Tony take you through them. So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brian. As Brian had mentioned, I am one of the partners for Roselli, Clark & Associates, and we've been doing the audit now since, I think, 2013 or 14, and every year we see that things are improving, finances are improving, internal controls are improving from when we first landed. And so I like to reiterate that for anyone who's new to the process, that there was a time when things weren't as great, and there's been a huge effort by the entire financial team and the executive branch, administrative branch of the town to just bring things to where they are now, which has resulted in a AAA bond rating. Those bond rates that Brian was mentioning earlier are a lot higher if you're not a AAA. I mean, they're really starting to move up. And so those are still very favorable rates when you compare yourself to the peers in the lesser credit-worthy communities. So you can see, we'll start with the slide on the reserve balances. I like to use this slide first. There was a big bump in 2021, and I'll remind everyone we're into 22. This is a 21 financial report, so we have not looked at the 22 numbers yet, but this is at how you stood at the end of 21. And you can see that if you go back to 2009, which was right after the financial collapse, you can see that the fund balances were not that great for a town of this size. And they've grown appreciably to almost over $35 million at this point in reserves. So that's basically made up of free cash plus your stabilization fund balances, is kind of to say it in layman's terms. Any questions on reserves?
Yeah, I'm always curious, what is the, I think I remember hearing in the past that maybe it was, at first glance, it was a little too high for like a basic percentage, but when you look at Nantucket and what could happen here being 30 miles out to sea, so is there a standard percentage usually of percentage of your operating budget? Or
the town heard loud and clear from Moody's probably back about 3 or 4 years ago that being out in a very vulnerable situation for storms and catastrophic events, that you needed a very high reserve ratio. And that's also combined with the insurance policies that you've taken out that are very high for catastrophic events. And hopefully the government would help if something happened, just like what's happening in Florida and in Puerto Rico in the last couple of months. So the town did take the initiative to build up those reserves to where Moody's felt they should be. And you were rewarded when that happened. So that's why the reserves have been on that trajectory. 21 was kind of an anomaly. You came out of the pandemic, forecasting a little lower on the revenues, got more, we got some really nice, the excise, the hotel and then,
Rooms.
the excise there. So all that helped to propel that a little bit. And so hopefully that does normalize, but it's the town's at a very healthy spot right now, probably one of the top 5 or 6 in the state.
Just a comment, Jason. I think keeping the stabilizations funded or even funded more is important because of what we're facing. So, and I think that still, some of that takes a vote of town meeting to come out, but you know, we have a lot of capital we're facing, and we've got other issues, sea level rise and other things. So I think stashing as much away there as we can is prudent.
And what this doesn't address, because this is based on a statutory balance sheet, if you go to the GAAP balance sheet, which Moody's doesn't look at that as much, but you've got this enormous OPEB liability out there. So you really do want to have some flexibility on this side, that at some point you want to address that OPEB liability, which we'll get into as we move through the presentation. But that's moved up significantly. So it is prudent to keep your eye on that. And then this is just a comparison, basically to the mid-range there. The high one is Nantucket. The mid-range is the state average, or actually the high-end metric for this was a Standard & Poor's metric. The Moody's metric is actually higher than that. And then the state average, which is about 10%. So you're well above those metrics. But again, like we've indicated, Nantucket is in an unusual situation where it is an island and it should be doing a little bit more, as Moody's had indicated. Okay, next. So this kind of just summarizes what we've already said about financial trends remaining excellent. Your S&P metric is 15%, your Moody's metric is 30%, and you're at about 35, 36%. So you're just above that Moody's metric. New growth continues, and you're walking that line between reserves and levy capacity very well. There's still some levy capacity that the town works with. The target bond rating was achieved in 2018. One of 15 communities statewide. I don't know of any that have done this since on the Moody's side. Moody's highlighted the strong reserves, the strong management, and producing early financial statements, which this town has years ago had a history of needing extensions and not getting your free cash on time. All that's gone now. We're here doing the 2022 audit. It's just started, October, so we should have some sort of a draft by the end of this month. And this is a little outdated right now because interest expenses are skyrocketing, but relative, the interest rates are low, like I had mentioned earlier. So it's important to fund your capital improvement at your most advantageous position.
I think we'll just cut that audio, hear you say the interest rates are low, and then just put that everywhere and see what everybody. I know what you mean relative, yeah.
Relative, yeah.
You just don't hear that anymore.
No.
Interest rates are low.
No, it's the mortgages are above 7% at this point, and it's getting a little 1980s like out there for those of us that are of the age to remember the 1980s.
My first mortgage at Something Natural was 18%.
Yeah.
$400,000 at 18% in 1984. So
Yeah, that sounds about right.
it was painful.
Even in the early 90s, when I did my first mortgage, it was like at 9.5 or 10%. And I thought I was getting a great deal back then because of the high rates in the 80s. So we have been spoiled by the last, since 2007 or 8, when we had the financial collapse and the feds knocked everything down, and they haven't really. They had a little blip around 15 or 16 where they popped them up, but they came right back down with the pandemic and everything. So we've been a little spoiled, and now we got to pay some back now, I guess. Okay, next slide. So here's some good topics: pension and OPEB. So pension, really good news on the pension side. The pension over at Barnstable County, which had been lagging most of the state, has really popped up. It was 75% funded on the last actuarial report, and that's a really nice number. And what makes it even nicer is they're using a 6.9% discount rate, which is one of the lowest in the state. So it's a very conservative number that Barnstable County is using to calculate the pension liability. Most of the other actuarial valuations I'm seeing are somewhere between 7.2 and 7.5. This is the first one I've seen below 7. So even with the conservative pension rate, the unfunded liability has gone up to, or the funded portion of the liability has gone up to 75%. So if you flip back 10 years ago when everyone was using 8%, had you still been using 8%, you'd probably be up over 90% right now, which is a really good spot to be in. Now, it'll be interesting to see where we land at the end of this year because of the issues with the stock market and everything else. But that was, as of the end of the last calendar year for pensions. So that's really good news. I know the town had started looking at a process where they were starting to look into the pension obligation bonds. And that would have been a really, really great thing to do back in March of 2020 when the borrowing rates were at, 1.5%. Had you had the legislation set up at that point, you could have jumped right into pension obligation bonds at that low rate. Also took advantage of a really low stock market, which had been hit. You'd probably be 100% funded. So myself and Brian have had conversations saying, hey, why not get the legislation set up? Get it set up so if there's another black swan event, like we seem to have them every 3 or 4 years where the rates just drop significantly, you're set up to jump into a situation where you can do a pension obligation bond. And the reason it would be advantageous is when you look at your discount rate of 6.9, if you can borrow a lot lower than that, that's all money to the pension system, that delta. And you want to be significantly lower than it. I'm seeing that I'm figuring 3 to 4% lower. Worcester County did one back in 2000 when the discount rate was 8 and they borrowed at 7 thinking 1% was good, and then .com happened. So they ended up taking a massive hit. So you've got to be a little careful there. But I think it's some great discussions we've had with the POBs. And the really good part about that is you can take that savings on your annual pension versus what your note payment would be, and you can start to push that towards OPEB without having it be a budget cruncher. So I think it's a great strategy if the investment interest rate market recovers. Any questions on that? Okay. OPEB. OPEB basically has been going up because the funding for OPEB hasn't been, in order to fund it, you'd have to fund it like the pension to get it to really into a nice situation. It's not statutorily required. So the OPEB funding is purely optional to towns. Some take an aggressive approach to funding it. Some don't fund it at all. Nantucket is somewhere in the middle. And I think it's a good place to be because of where you are with the pensions. If the pensions do what they should in the next 10 years and you get to 100% funding on the pension, then you can start directing a more aggressive funding policy towards the OPEB. But right now that remains elevated. I think you're at about 6 or 7% funded on the OPEB. Okay, any thoughts or questions on that?
Was it the pension of the OPEB that grew 50 million from 2015? Unfunded, or was it unfunded pension liability, or was it
the pension? Yes, the pension grew a lot, and like I said, it's starting to come back down because you added a lot of employees, and from where you were in 15, because we did bring that up a few years ago. That why was there such a disconnect? When I look at my other towns that are in Barnstable County, they weren't going up as much as Nantucket. So I asked Brian, I said, what's going on? And once you started going through the process, you learned that the town had grown significantly. So you were adding employees, and that's going to contribute to the liability being larger. But it's going in the right direction now. Any other questions or thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm looking up. You had some recommendations under other post-employee benefits. Increase the annual funding to OPEB, adopt a funding schedule that uses a pension funding windfall, consider converting the investment policy to a modern portfolio with greater equity allocation. So those are the 3 things there, and I think they're things we should consider.
So
I think it's important.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things you probably ought to consider is that in about 10 years, you're going to have a pension windfall. In other words, you're going to be fully funded and your pension's going to go from this, it's going to drop significantly. So there's going to be a big savings there that's already baked into your budget. I think if you developed a policy now that when that happens, some portion of that's going to go to OPEB, you begin to adopt that philosophy and it's out there and people are listening to it and they get used to it. I had one town that went 100% in 2021, and they tried to take the difference to OPEB, and it was a war. The school wanted a piece, the public works wanted a piece. It turned into a war because they didn't really have a policy set up, And they're like, hey, this should go to everybody because we're all in the pension system. So start to develop some strategy around that now so that it's engraved in your policies.
Just one note, when we developed the financial policies, I think way back in 2016, we did come back in 2017 when we were doing the OPEB valuation, and the board adopted a policy to do that.
They did, okay.
They will. So in 2038, when the pension on the current funding schedule will be fully funded, the savings after that would be directed to, a portion thereof would be directed into the OPEB fund. So we did deal with that back then to get the benefit of the a different discount rate in OPEB because of that anticipation. So we have done that, and we internally, to respond to a couple of those other comments, as well as that, we internally have had discussions periodically about considering changing or increasing the OPEB funding, but as with everything else, I mean, we are making a $500,000 investment every year, and that's very substantial compared to what a lot of the other communities, with the exception of Wellesley, are doing. But it is something that we have talked about as well along the way.
And the 500 started, a number of years ago, but that came out of FinCom, something that I pushed on FinCom way back because of, looking at the numbers and realizing that we need to start funding it.
And last year, if you recall, in 2021, we bypassed making the appropriation because of coming out of the pandemic. And if you recall, at the 2022 annual town meeting, we did take $500,000 of free cash and make a second payment to bring that back up, just so it's currently consistent at the $500,000 a year right now.
And just for those listening in, OPEB is other post-employment benefits. It's basically health insurance that you are obligated to pay individuals who have worked for the town who are now retired. You're obligated to pay for a portion of that. And what's happening is people are living longer. Your labor force is growing, so it's bigger. So what happens to communities that are not thinking about this is you wake up one day and you've just got this massive number that you have to deal with. You got insurance costs that are going up, so everything's going against you. And so it's really important to think about this now so that you don't have a budget issue in the future when this becomes a really, really, really significant liability. So just to kind of let everyone at home or in the audience know that that's what we're talking about here. Okay, next is just some informational items. So you have network security, just telling all my communities, it's a reminder, it's in every management letter, that just remain vigilant, do your training, do your own internal phishing to see if anyone's vulnerable. And I know the town's doing all that, but just to remain on top of that, because it's not pretty when something happens. It's just an ugly situation. So stay on top of that. The NRTA, the town provides certain services on behalf of the NRTA. There are risks to doing that. Brian, I don't know if you want to kind of elaborate a little bit more, but
Sure.
I've suggested that maybe the town lessen that, which I believe you have, but there are still some things where
we have over the years, they have Paula and her staff have worked really hard. They've removed themselves from all of our insurances. Basically, we're down at this point to, we still process their payroll, and Tony and I have had numerous discussions about potential risks if we were not to file something timely and they were to get fined, whether we'd have to cover that fine for them. It's a risk that we've talked about at this point. We're still comfortable accepting it, but it may be something that we continue to talk about and transition at a point in the future sometime. So, but we have taken it seriously as they've brought it up, and we've worked hard with Paula to reduce the level of risk that we had in the shared services.
Any thoughts on that? Okay, GASB update, won't bore you with that, but that's the big one this year is the leases. And myself and Brian have talked about the leases the town has. There's a different accounting treatment for those, so that'll be the little headache this year for the audit from a financial standpoint, but nothing operational that the town needs to be too concerned about. Next is ARPA. So just again, a reminder, and I know it's not happening here, But the $10 million exemption, Nantucket qualifies for that, where it's all revenue replacement, so you can use the ARPA on basically any municipal purposes. But I'm recommended to my towns that they use it like free cash for one-time items, for capital, for emergency situations, and not try to use it to plug a budget like some of my other clients are, which they'll have a problem in 2025 when it runs out. So that's just a reminder that that's not a budget plugger, ARPA, and should be used for the one-time items, which the town we talked about is doing. Lastly, on the informational items, which is a nice little thing, is the investment yields. So the last few years, we've been at 0.5 on the checking accounts and the money markets. With what the FOMC is doing, increasing borrowing rates, well, guess what? Investment yields are going to start to creep up. So you're going to start to see that. The town sits on quite a bit of cash, so this is a reminder to just stay vigilant, keep the banks honest. The banks don't call you saying, hey, we can offer you 2% instead of 0.5%. Stay on top of it. It can amount to a pretty good sized number here in Nantucket. So that's a little piece of good advice. Okay, next. Okay, some findings. We get to the findings and recommendations. There are some receivable credit balances. So those arise either because somebody either overpaid their tax bill and doesn't know, or it was posted to the wrong account, or there's just some systemic error. But there's a few of them, and they need to be addressed. They need to be processed. If they're owed to someone, they should be refunded. If they're errors, they should be corrected. But those have been kind of building up, and so we thought it was worth mentioning that the town probably should go through a process of correcting those. Next is there is a very old, and by very old, I say probably more than 10 years old, a bond and band premium account that's kind of sitting there. And there's been a lot of new rules with this. In the past, you'd amortize it and bring in a little bit at a time. On any new issues, you can actually use it towards the projects. You can use it to lower the borrowing. At this point, the town should really investigate what this balance is. And if it's deemed to be very old, stagnant, and the issues don't exist anymore, those bond issuances should probably take it into income. So that's something that we've talked about. Same with stagnant special revenue accounts. About 5 years ago, we had this comment that there was a lot of accounts just not being used. What happens is the department heads have a bunch of special revenue at their disposal, and then you have turnover. So the new department head is not aware of those accounts. So they're not in there eagerly spending against them. So those have started to build up again. So I pointed it out to the finance office that, hey, you might want to go through these accounts, sit down with the department heads and let them know you've got money in gift accounts, you've got some old revolving accounts, you've got some money out there that you can basically spend on a purpose of the department. So and there's a fair amount. Okay, any thoughts on that page?
I got a couple. On that, you were talking about on tipping fees and water inventory and payroll tests repeated. Are those things that we're going to address in this fiscal year? Is that?
I think a lot of them were originally highlighted in fiscal 20, I think, and as the pandemic hit, we probably weren't able to concentrate on all of those. So we're working on them now into this fiscal year. The receivable credit balances, we're working, a lot of this really is on the water company side. People are just sending in checks and it sits there, and they've done a better job about looking at the length of time that it's there and either sending it back, or if there's open balances, working to apply them against the sewer or irrigation. So I think a lot of that is most likely going to filter itself out as we go through. The old bond and band premiums, we've been working on identifying it because it was before municipal modernization. We actually would be able to allocate it towards capital projects or projects of that nature. So for this cycle and capital, it would potentially be available as a funding source. to take to town meeting to ask for approval to use in the articles. The town manager and I did go through the stagnant special revenue accounts a few years ago, and we were able to take back quite a bit of money and it was actually taken into free cash because it'd been there for since before I got there. It is something that we have looked at, but to Tony's point, it is creeping a little bit. So it's something that both the town manager and I have talked about, her and I going through those first and then going to the department heads and seeing what we can do, or if the use is gone. And then if it isn't necessary, we would take it to free cash. So it is being worked on, yes.
Right, and just for the public to know, this payroll test, they audited, 25 employees and found the files weren't complete. Things like that, I think, are happening.
That's on the next page. I
Oh,
think.
is it? Oh, I'm
That's
ahead of you
okay.
then. So
Well,
I'll let you give your
yeah.
report.
And then
I
I'll
thought it was
respond.
up.
Oh, actually, we skipped it.
No, we did not.
Oh, there we go. The tipping
Oh, there you
fees.
go.
Yeah,
Okay.
there we go. So yeah, we've let's go right from let's forget we had this conversation. We'll start at the top and readdress the conversation. So old outstanding receivables is really personal property, motor vehicle going back years and years. And there's a process you have to use. It is cumbersome, but it is a legal process you have to use. But if we don't do anything about it, those receivables will be there 50 years from now because they're not getting paid. They're just so old. A lot of those are just not getting paid. So best way to get them off the ledgers is by going through the abatement process that the state requires you to do, which is basically the collector requesting that the assessor give her permission to write those off. So you got to put a list together. You basically got to say, well, this is a business that went out of business. They're never gonna, we're never gonna collect that personal property. So there's a process. It's been in the letter for a few years. Some of it has been worked on. It is dwindling, but they're still there. Collection of the tipping fees, we thought would be, it is a fairly large amount of money, and we've always thought that should be handled by the folks that collect money instead of having it handled by the department. So we said, that should be directed towards the collector's office, the town collector's office. And that's been there for a couple of years.
So the collection of the tipping fees, I can just let the board know that has been addressed because we do have a position now in the finance department. That position in collections is dealing specifically with collection of tipping fees and working with all the customers and identifying which ones are out of business and are not going to be collectible. So that one has been done, and we are responsible internally in my office now for collecting all the landfill accounts.
Okay, next is water inventory procedures. I mean, there's some valuable inventory at the water department. And a few of the things I had highlighted was simply just counting it, once a quarter and comparing that to what you have in your ledgers, just to make sure, that it's accounted for. So a lot of that stuff still hasn't been addressed or corrected. There's been some turnover at the water department. So hopefully that's something that will be looked at, in this fiscal year.
Tony, so this is from 2021. So like the last example, the tipping fees, 21, it wasn't there, but in this year you've started fixing some things.
In fiscal 22, that position was established and hired actually near the end of 22, excuse me, I forget we're in 23 now. So that has been accomplished. I'm working with Mark to institute a quarterly cycle count for the inventory to get that process back underway. There has been, they have had at least 2 business managers since the one retired a few years ago. So it's been a little bit of a transition, but now that there's some stability there, we are working back to put that in place. And that would be a count where we would come down, they would produce the inventory list, and we would go down and count it to make sure so that we're visualizing it and overseeing that count from my office.
And just so everyone's aware, the management letter has been out for a little bit, but for various reasons with the pandemic and ARPA and all that sort of stuff, we haven't been able to do the presentation like we're doing tonight, but Brian's had it. He's been working on these things. So a lot of these things are being, there's progress being made on these things. at this point. And these are 2021 items, just so everyone is aware.
Just a quick comment. That's interesting, Brian. So they'll do inventory on a fairly regular basis, and once a month, you'll check parts of it.
We probably would do it quarterly, Matt, to
Quarterly.
be honest with
Oh,
you.
well,
I
sorry,
think,
quarterly.
and it'll just be on a cycle, and
Yeah.
they'll give us the inventory counts, and we'll go down and randomly, haphazardly select, in water meters, they may say they have 50 of them. We'll haphazardly to prove that they're there. So yes,
Randomly pick a
and
couple
randomly,
items,
and
yeah.
we won't tell them what schedule of inventory we're going to review, so that nobody has any idea. But it will be in place. And in all my private experience, we did cycle counts, so we are going to institute that again.
Right, and it's real, and it's positive for them as well, because if you have one person doing the inventory, they may miss something, or they may make a mistake, and then they're blind to it. This is what I find doing inventory. And if you have a check, 2 or 3 people, and there's a check on the system, it's a lot, you're not going to run out of things. You're not going to have too much. It makes a lot of sense.
Okay, and on the payroll test, as you had mentioned, that's every few years we go through the files and figure out if they're complete. Are they up to date for the new tax laws on the W-4s? The I-9 form is constantly changing. So are the things in the files complete? We found that they weren't 100% complete last time we looked. We put it as a finding. And we also said it would be advisable for the town to maybe do periodic audits of those personnel files, look at, say, 25 or 30 on an annual basis, just to make sure that those files are complete. Human resources is an area you got to stay on top of, and if you're in violation of any of the rules and things on human resources, it's an area that could come back to bite you. So it's important to make sure that area is in compliance.
And I do think that some of that was relating to, I think the state paperwork was some of that they didn't find, but we've worked very hard with the HR department to identify people haven't turned it in to make sure. So it's something that they take seriously as well.
And then, obviously, I wanted to talk about old outstanding receivables again.
I think this one may actually be related to the receivables from Comstar for ambulance billing, which
yes, right.
which
right.
has been creeping up, and we've been working with Comstar to determine whether or not there's any viability of collections, because a lot of times it's on the list, but they're still trying to collect, and we're working with them, and also do have to come up with a procedure, because we've never really looked at this in my time, even I think before I even got here. We need to come up with a procedure on how far we go and then when we write it off. But it is something we're working with the outside vendor on, who is responsible for the billing and the collection of those ambulance fees.
Yeah, and the medical billings is a very complicated field, and it does, the cycle is not your normal collecting 30 days or 60 days. It's a process. Going through health insurance and everything else. So we do expect it to have the aging be older than normal, than a normal setting. But this one is kind of getting outside of the range, and it probably is time to look at it and come up with some sort of a policy. There could be individuals that have passed away that are still on the list because they had used the ambulance survey. So you try to So you try to at least filter out a lot of that's just never going to be collectible.
Did I read it correctly that you expect 50% of the billings not to be recovered, give or take?
I don't know if it's exact. I mean, I think that's a rough estimate. I don't know. We've
That's a
had
big
numerous
number.
other conversations with them as well, and some of the we didn't expect to collect was actually collected. So I think we have to look at everyone on a case-by-case basis and go through it. There is a certain amount that most likely will not be collectible. Within those, though, yes, that's correct.
I just thought it was interesting. It was a big number. Yeah.
I think that might be it, unless there's another page.
More receivables.
Just question, more receivables. No.
One question that you had, one of the recommendations was the school, the DES chart of accounts. Are they working on that?
We have not started working on it. It's that, to be honest with you, is in the school CFO's hands on whether he wants to implement that, and we would work with them and Munis to do it. It's not something that I'm going to run out and undertake. It deals with the school's chart of accounts. He hasn't gotten to that point where he's started it, and I'm not sure Tony would be able to answer. I'm not sure if it's becoming mandatory to make that conversion.
Yeah, it's in the compliance list, so it
So
is
then-
it is a mandatory.
So then we'll have to
item.
at some point undertake it.
That's why I'm
at the
asking.
school's
I was
direction.
wondering if it was
Yeah.
mandatory, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like something I wouldn't want to do, so I don't blame him, but
Yeah, you put it at the back of the list, and Desi takes our reports and they look at it and they say, okay, this is the least important on the bucket list of findings. If this is a finding, you know, we'll kind of work with the town, as opposed to if you're putting sped expenses in the wrong place on the report, because now that affects how you get Chapter 70 and different funding mechanisms. So until Desi says we're shutting down your school, you know, it's going to be an item that's just it is going to drag, and it will be on this year's management letter again, and hopefully it goes away next year. But you know, it's going to take I think a little bit of pushing to get it to happen.
no, it's,
Anything else for Brian or Tony?
one other question while you're here, Tony, is you mentioned that we've got a new growth, and our new growth has been great, and we've got a good number. Are we planning if if things sort of stagnate for a while and we don't have that new growth, what kind of shape are we in? Are we in, Brian knows it's one of my favorite topics, but are we prepared, if we don't have 4.5 million a year or whatever it is?
I think, what's your levy capacity about, Brian?
Levy capacity is just over 100 million right now.
I'm levy, your unused levy
Unused
capacity,
is
sorry.
generally around 3%, 2.5% to 3%. So we do have unused levy capacity. We had about just under, I think, quite right around 2 million when we made some, adjusted for additional new growth that we hadn't planned on in the budget and changes to some of the local estimated receipts. To answer your question, Matt, I do think we're okay. I think because obviously, even if things stagnate a little bit, we're not going to zero new growth. So the gap that we would have to make up would not be, it'd probably be maybe 300,000 to 500,000 or something. It wouldn't be over $1 million with the new growth. So we would never go exactly to zero. So I do think we would have the ability to absorb it in the short term.
Yeah, and I think with your unused levy and the reserves you've built up, which you're now above where you need to be, if that new growth does level off, it may slow down some of the capital that you do year to year. But I don't think, from where we stand right now, I don't see it as a major problem. Once we do see those indicators that point in the wrong direction, we'll have conversations about it. And with what the feds are doing right now on trying to slow down growth and trying to reel the economy back in, who knows how that's going to affect cities and towns 12 months from now or 24 months from now. So it is something to keep an eye on, for sure. And but from where I look at your financials, I every year I say this is the year that might not be a great year, and when we look at the numbers, it's like, what happened? We got to go look to see what happened to make it such a great year, and it's happened like 2 or 3 straight years. So
One other just question is, we were adding a lot of staff the last couple of years. I'm guessing that we haven't. We've tried to, but we've been unable to hire in a lot of departments. So that has probably had a positive effect on a lot of our budgets.
Yes.
Are we factoring that into our future projections? At some point, maybe we will be able to hire staff again. So I don't know if that's something you're aware of or how that is factored into this.
So in every budget, so the presentation that I gave to, I believe it was 2 weeks ago at this point, or the rollover number that we started as the baseline for salary included an assumption that every position that was funded in the budget that may be vacant now is filled. So we do every budget process that we go through, we assume that those will be funded at the start of the new fiscal year. Because I would not, if we didn't do it any other way, then we would potentially put ourselves in a negative position, which I would never want to happen. So we do plan it that way.
Anything else? Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Brian.
Have a great night.
It's very impressive where we're at financially.
Yeah, I remember the bad old days. This is
Mhm.
hugely different.
I remember the bad old days too, and they were really bad. And I want to thank Brian and his team for bringing us to where we are today. We, as Tony mentioned, we are very well positioned, and in discussions that I have with my counterparts in other towns, we're quite a bit more well off in many cases. So thank you very much, Brian.
And we're
Tony.
asking questions about what about this and what about that toward the future. We didn't even know what the last year had been. Boards that I served on early on, we didn't have the budget, we didn't have the reports. We were years behind. So it's incredible.
Yeah, we're talking about 2038 pension,
Yeah.
funding. Like it's a great point, Matt.
Brian is, do you think Cinder's ready? Yeah. She's not on yet, okay.
Right, you want to go to number 4, and then we'll come back when she comes on?
Sure.
Is that okay? All right.
So number 4 is a requirement of the state's loan application to fund this project. We have done this authorization before, and it's just to file the loan. It's a formal requirement for the extension of the water main west of the airport's water main, the continuation of that project, basically.
Any questions?
So, motion to approve the request.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, that passes 4-0. Oh, that's good timing.
Perfect.
Hi, Cinder. You are up for our bond sales environment overview. Great timing.
Oh, hi, thanks for having me. If it's a bond sale overview, I guess I would start with that the town is just recently, on September 29th, last Thursday, sold a Series A tax exempt bond that was 20 years level debt service, a Series B taxable issue that was affordable housing. All of this was affordable housing. That was 15 years taxable. You sold a $13.4 million bond anticipation note that runs out until it's dated, I think, October 14th. It goes to next June 30th or a date in June. And for $13.4 million, you sold a grant anticipation note for $875,000. This was an issue that we wanted to, had we been able to, it was very complicated because of the nature of the purpose of the bonds and figuring out what could be done on a tax exempt basis in terms of the affordable housing versus the taxable basis. The town, as you know, sold bonds back on July 14th. And at the time you sold 20-year tax exempt and 15-year taxable then, but it didn't include this issue because this issue was much more complicated. And we wanted to get that issue into the market in July as soon as we could to take advantage of what was happening in the trend with interest rates. Interest rates have been going up. They've probably gone up 200 basis points easily since a year ago. And they've been steadily going up. Feds met in September, so the July issue was in advance of September Fed meeting, and this issue is that you sold last Thursday is in advance of another Fed meeting that's scheduled for November 1st and 2nd, when rates are anticipated to go up again. Interest rates went up 75. The Fed rates went up 75 basis points back in September, and they went up. Let me see, when was it before that? The Fed met also on the 26th and 27th of July. So that July issue beat the Fed meeting then. So that was the goal. The issue back in July sold it close to about 75 basis points below where the issue last Thursday sold, and on both the tax exempt and the taxable bonds. So they were basically mirrored each other. The issues right now had a little bit longer average life. These were sold on a level debt service basis. And, I think what we've seen over the course of the last year, frankly, has been, well, we've seen it over the last couple of years. Before rates started going back up, we saw an acceleration, a mass acceleration of debt in the last couple of years, trying to take advantage of what a year ago would have been under 2% for a 20-year bond. Now the goal, people have needed a reality check on what's been going on in the market. And most people haven't been following it day to day and watching it going up almost day to day. And there's been a lot of volatility, but in the municipal market, especially most recently, there's been some stability with the municipal market. There's been solid number of bids. You got on this bond sale the other day, you got 5 bids on the Series A. You only got 2 bids on the Series B because it was taxable. It was smaller. It was only $3.5 million. But it was a good rate to sell under in this market right now. To get under 4% is pretty much what most issuers are trying to take advantage of, locking in with tax exempt 20-year debt, and on taxable debt, getting in under 5%, which you did with the TIC on the tax exempt Series A 20-year bonds was a 386, and on the taxable it was 100 basis points higher at 486. And we've seen the next, the next Fed meeting is November 1st and 2nd. That's what issuers right now are trying to beat, with the assumption that the Feds are going to raise rates again. Some of what's anticipated and expected is already built into the market by the time you get to market, but some of it isn't. And what we've seen right after each of the Fed meetings in the last several months, where they've raised rates, that right after that meeting, rates go up probably, they've been ratcheting up, 25, 50 basis points right after it. So we're seeing a lot less supply as issuers have gotten into the market to take advantage of what they can. And my assumption is that we're going to continue to see rates increase, and we're going to see less supply likely as we go back to what, continue to see rates increase. It used to be that we were happy when we finally got down to 4% on 20-year debt, coming down from 8% and 6% to 5% to 4%. Right now, issuers aren't used to seeing a 4% rate on a 20-year bond. Frankly, you got a 4.2% rate on that grant note. Short-term rates, you've got inverted yield curves in the taxable market. You've got, the short-term note rates on the $13.4 million grant regular bond anticipation note. That the NIC was a 3.22, which is extremely good. A 10-year bond is selling at 3.5% right now. So the 1-year note is the same difference as basically a 10-year bond. So I don't know if there's more questions. I mean, I think that what we've seen is a relentless increase in interest rates since before January 1 of 2022. And we've seen a tremendous acceleration of debt. Anybody that could get in has been trying to beat the Fed meeting dates, as they meet, I think, 7 times a year. And we've seen, when the town sold its issue back in July, that was better timing, but this issue couldn't get in at the same time. This is good timing relative to what's anticipated in the next couple of months. The Feds meet again in November. They meet again in December. And we've got issues that normally would come in March that are trying to get in December right now. As it's, we'll see what happens with supply. That's been less supply. There's been a transition in the last month of a lot of large national issuers have tried to get in the market on a competitive basis rather than negotiated. They used to bid negotiate, but they've been wanting to get in and competitive sales has been a flip-flop in that. The town traditionally sells competitive on the Series A bonds that you just sold. You got 5 bids for a $6.1 million issue. That's pretty good to get that kind of interest. Same thing with Series B. It was only $3,570,000 in taxable. Taxable debt is less attractive right now. And taxable rates have skyrocketed, as you've seen with treasury bonds and mortgage rates. So that's kind of an overview. I think, you know, it's been volatile. The municipal market's been holding its own. And I think the town did really well. When it came in, it did better than anybody else that week. Like, you know, Nantucket has great name recognition. You've had great results. If there was a rating above AAA, I think you'd get it, but that's a rating that stands on its own. And that's the overview. I think that's the overview that I can give you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about that issue or any other issuance that's been taking place.
Thank you, Senator. Maybe they'll make a AAA plus just for
That's what I
Nantucket.
was thinking. I thought they should do that for your bonds right now with how you performed in 2022, 2021.
Brian, is there anything else you want her to review or just to
No, I
weigh in on?
think, you know, we've gone to market a few times in the last few months and we've come before you. And I think that it was kind of important just to get, we spend a lot of time, I do, talking to Cinder and her staff at Hilltop, trying to figure out the best time to borrow for these projects as we go through the year, not only for cash flow, but to help make sure that we're in the market. And it was competitive, but I thought it was a good idea because we haven't had her come in for a little while to just give their observations. I think we'll talk more about it as we get closer to the next issuance, but I think we're looking at potentially maybe a little bit of a slowdown to try to see if the market will calm itself down in any way, which probably won't happen. But again, I think it's good to hear from our financial advisor periodically on what they're seeing and how our bond sales compare.
Question, Brooke?
Yeah, I'm interested about your comment about the complexity of the affordable housing, borrowing for affordable housing rather than
sure.
other purposes.
Sure. So a lot of that complexity revolves around just some of the strategic programs that they have undertaken. As an example, you know, the helping to finance the Housing Nantucket's construction, the project on Fairgrounds Road is very complex and has a lot of moving parts, and some of it is tax exempt and some of it, you know, with the mortgage becomes taxable, and how much can be tax exempt versus how much can be taxable. It all becomes, it gets really complex with these financing as we move with numerous components that the Affordable Housing Trust is putting together to try to help finance in some of these projects and then acquire some land acquisition that the trust may be doing with the Neighborhood First or any of those other funding sources is relatively straightforward. But this one, they get a little bit trickier, like I said, when we have multiple purposes for the same within the same project. We with the one for Housing Nantucket, we had a portion of it's a grant, portion of it is a mortgage, and there's rules about financing with how much can be tax exempt in the issuance, and we have to review extensively with bond counsel what the purpose is and what the structure looks like. And then they make I've had numerous meetings with Tucker involved in those meetings with bond counsel to try to do it. And this one was just a little bit more complex with that. And ultimately, the majority, actually all of that $3.7 million taxable is all related to the Fairgrounds Road work in the structure of it. But it's not anything it's complex, but we are able to get to the point that makes sense and to work through it. And we've got a few other similar projects that we're trying to work through with them. So.
Thank you.
I would add that the town's outstanding bond anticipation notes mature on October 14th. These bonds are delivering on October 13th, and the proceeds will be used to pay off the maturing notes. The July issue advance funded what's maturing on October 14th to the extent possible. The July issue was a $30 million deal. And so we did take out what's maturing on October 14th as much as possible. We took advantage of interest rates back in July so that we could deal with that. But with regard to, like Brian was just saying, the affordable housing, it's taken since then to sort through the diligence questions associated with the what could be tax exempt versus taxable. So here we are. And the only other comment I have, because I just looked at my notes, that the note that you issued that's just going out for 9 months is a 3.22, whereas the 20-year bond is a 3.86. So I think that tells you a little bit of what a strong rate that is on the bond in today's market. Pretty flat yield curve, but it's there's no point in rolling notes that most of those notes are renewal and new money and expected to be paid, some of it paid down when they mature next June. But the town took advantage of bonding and locking in rates on as much as they could of all the notes that are outstanding now that are maturing in October, as well as putting in what components of new money it could to lock that in too before rates go up further.
Any other questions or comments? Brian, anything else?
No, I mean, I think we certainly, I think the town, we certainly appreciate all of the work from Hilltop because they spend a lot of time with us on the phone going through this and coming up with assumptions and calculations for us to make the decisions on, and it's not an easy task. And I think we're probably laying the groundwork across the Commonwealth for affordable housing, for building affordable housing and how to finance it, because every time we come to them with a request to review a borrowing, they say we've never seen something like this before. So I think we're laying the groundwork for other communities right now.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Senator, for coming on tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Thanks for having me. Have a nice night.
Thanks, Senator.
I was just going to add, and the funding for the different projects comes from different buckets, which have different restrictions associated with them. So that all goes into the due diligence that Cinder was talking about. So, really appreciate the work that Brian and Cinder and Bond Council do to allow us to advance the agenda on affordable housing.
Thanks, Tucker. Okay, that's finished up number 3. We move on to town manager's report.
Thank you. First, I just have a brief verbal update on our Island Home and the Senior Center projects. I think I mentioned last week or the week before, I assembled a work group of stakeholders who have connections to both projects. The work group met September 27th, and we are making them responsible for obtaining feedback and input from their groups and others as needed as to programs, services, activities for each project, and to help with outreach and conveyance of information about the projects. Bob Eisenstein of Eisenstein Flaherty Associates, that is the firm the town is contracted with to provide administrative and other services for the operation of the Island Home. He is serving as our internal project manager. We still, of course, need an owner's project manager, which is the next step in our process to secure that owner's project manager and get the procurement underway. And we have a meeting actually tomorrow to sort that out. At some point, we will need a separate owner's project manager for the senior center project. But another current task with respect to the senior center is to have an engineering firm take a look at the current Our Island Home facility to help evaluate the feasibility of renovating and repurposing it to be the senior center, or demolish and rebuild. So just FYI, the members of the work group, and it's an informal work group, it's not like a formally appointed group, include myself, Bob Eisenstein, Kathy Greeter, representing the Nantucket Center for Elder Affairs, Laura Stewart, our senior center coordinator, Rick Sears, assistant town manager, Rachel Day from Sherburne Commons, Dawn is our select board rep, Ken Bogrand, the CEO from the Nantucket Cottage Hospital, Michelle Monroe from Our Island Home, Peter Schaefer from the Finance Committee, Julie Fitzgerald from the Council on Aging, and 2 Our Island Home employees. And I might have mixed up Julie and Kathy Greeter's affiliations, but they're both on the work group. So just FYI on that. Next, we have preliminary fiscal 2024 capital projects review. I think Brian and perhaps Sue Carmel, our new assistant finance director, are going to take us through this. We have been doing this review with the board right around now for the past few years to start giving you a preview of what is most likely upcoming for fiscal 24 capital. Brian?
Hi, thank you, Libby. Erica, could you go to the second slide, please? The next one. Next one, yeah. So we're going to start here on this progress update. As town manager mentioned, back in August this year, we gave a preliminary update to the select board, FinCom, and capital program committee chairs. Brief discussion about capital for the upcoming cycle. Town manager and other individuals, the assistant finance director, Rick, assistant town manager now, assistant finance director, Sue Carmel now is involved in this. We're continuing the review of the projects and ranking them in order of priority, which is generally nearing completion from the town side. And then we'll begin working with Capcom on their recommendations and seeing how they all line up. We're continuing to work after discussions with Capcom on projects to refine them and refine the requests. That's a continuing process. Capital Program Committee is still continuing to meet on every Thursday to review the capital projects. We did work with the airport. The airport was in last week, so they're continuing. They're doing their rankings as well. I will say that certainly through everybody's effort, the department heads understanding, I think, the process even better a little now. There's been a lot of improvements in the amount of supporting documentation that they've been providing for not only town administration to review, but being able to be sent along to Capital Program Committee. So we certainly appreciate their efforts in that. It makes all the reviews a little bit easier as we go. We have the town manager, myself, and Sue have started and undertaken with the department heads a review of prior year projects to get an update. We're concentrating on projects that have a timeline of older than, I think, 2020 annual town meeting, to just get the status, whether they've been started, if we think they're going to start. Realistically, one of the things that we're looking at when we do this is, are there projects that, well, we thought when we funded them back then that they were a good idea, but given the time lapse, are they not something we're going to approach at this point? Is there an opportunity for reappropriation? If it's completely done, is there a chance to reappropriate any unneeded or unspent funding, I should say? So that's a process that we're working on as we go through this to potentially be able to allocate more to capital expenditures at the annual town meeting. And we continue to work with the developer, they're called Plum, to update and enhance the software that we've developed for this use within all the departments. So next slide. I'll give you a brief overview. I don't think I'm going to go in too much depth unless you have questions about some of these projects. But for fiscal 24, we brought before the Capital Program Committee and Town Administration continuation of the townwide document management system. That request is for $500,000. We've continued the allocation here for coastal resiliency planning. The recommended allocation that we've brought forward to them is $1 million. We have left and continued the consideration for the island-wide underground wiring feasibility study. An effort with electric vehicles and seeing the use of the charging station, we have included $50,000 to continue to construct those around the island at various locations. Based on the meeting from last week relative to paid parking, we have left in a recommendation for the start at $100,000 in capital. I think there's still internal discussions about whether that needs to change, but that's the starting point that we've begun with. And then the staff vehicle at town admin that's used to go to various meetings is, I think, approaching 10 or 11 years old. So there was a request and a recommendation to consider replacing that. Excuse me.
Quick comment, just it's sort of an aside, but not really. We can look at the underground wiring and say, what's the big deal? A friend in Florida was in one of the few towns that has all their wires underground, and they were one of the few towns that had electricity through the whole, they got hit fairly hard, but they had electricity through the whole mess down there. And a lot of the others didn't and don't still and won't for a long time. So from a resiliency standpoint, it's a really good thing to do. So I just thought that was interesting. And they had firsthand experience. There's a lot of towns now, there's no AC, no one has AC, it's hot, and it's a mess. And this town particularly was fine, so.
Next slide, please. Public safety, there's a request and a recommendation before the Capcom for rescue equipment. This is actually, I think it's changed a little bit from what it used to be, but there is a component of trench rescue, which the former chief had advocated for. We have left that in, and we're going through our review process. Capcom has already reviewed it with the former fire chief. A replacement for engine 1, $80,000 for a staff vehicle. And then something that just came forward, I did want to note. So you'll remember over the last, I think it's 4 years, we have every year allocated money to replace the self-contained breathing apparatuses. There was a request that recently came forward to consider a breathing apparatus refill trailer that could be used in an emergency rather than having to bring them back to be refilled. So we have put that in, and we'll be presenting that to FinCom at a subsequent meeting. The Marine Department has a request for $550,000 for permitting, planning, and dredging of both Pulpus and Nantucket harbors. And the Police Department in fiscal '24 doesn't have any current requests, but they do have a few out-year requests. Next slide, please, Erica. Oh, thank you. Public Works, this is a placeholder. There's still work on, this is one of that we continue to refine. There's $2 million request for Washington Street parking lot reconstruction, and then $50,000 for security cameras and lighting at some of the town-owned facilities. Under the transportation, $375,000 request for work at the DPW to replace the fuel tank. Continuing with the sidewalk improvement plan, the request is for $1.1 million. The request came forward for $3 million for island-wide road maintenance, this would be a supplement to the Chapter 90 allocation that we get awarded every year. There's a request for $1 million for Millie's Bridge abutment stabilization and a dune restoration project. $1 million for continued repair and annual maintenance to the multi-use paths that we have along the town. $550,000 for cobblestones. It is very expensive to replace the cobblestones, so that is another request that we received. And then $100,000 for the work necessary at the Sconset footbridge. If you remember, a few years ago, we did get an analysis or a report on the integrity of that, and this would continue the funding to make repairs to that structure. And then the very large one, which I think we had general conversations with the board about at a previous meeting, a $13 million appropriation for Surfside area road reconstruction, Lovers Lane, Monahans, and Orkawa. This would be supplemental funding to the amounts that we currently have in there.
Brian, I just want to point out the Millie's Bridge, a good testament to how, I think it was, I can't remember, it was somebody here tonight said how we're all working together, different departments to figure things out. I think it was Raceway we were talking about, but Millie's, it was originally appropriated just to fix the bridge and shore it up. And then with the coastal resiliency plan, with Vincent being in his position, they looked at it differently and are approaching it differently, not just fixing up the bridge, fixing the area around it with the dune restoration. So I just think it's a good example of how we've adapted. What do you always say, Matt, how we don't want to shift our psychological, we already started it, we don't want to change. This is an example where
Psychology of previous investment.
There you go. All right. It's a good version of how it adapted, but it wouldn't happen without crack and without some other things. So good flex there.
Thank you, Erica. Under DPW General, we have a $3.8 million request for Nobody or Soccer Field addition and expansions of the park, and that is all consistent with the master plan that was done. Next page, please. Hazard mitigation. There's a $4 million request for to do work for the Maya Comet Pond design, permitting, and dredging. I believe that some of this would be offset by contributions and potentially working with the land bank, if I remember correctly, but we would, since we probably are the lead on it, we would need to fund the entire piece of it, and then those would offset any costs that we have. And then the harbors plan, the HMP implementation, year 3, $100,000 request. Natural Resources has one request this year, which is $500,000 for continuation of the baseline environmental data program, which they'll be presenting at an upcoming meeting to Capcom. It's kind of good that we're talking about IT, since our auditor did remind us about the importance of network security. They have two requests: a continuation to maintain the network infrastructure, and then the annual allocation this year. It's in the amount of $69,000 to continue to replace the town computers that they have on a 3-year cycle. All told, the general fund preliminary requests are $37,424,000, which is slightly down from the approved requests of last year of $69,250,000. So some of the larger ones that we have included this year is the $13 million that I mentioned for Surfside area roads. The Maya Comet dredging, design, and construction is $4 million, and then Nobody or Soccer Field and expansion is $3.8 million. Is it the board's pleasure to take them all through the airport capital, or do they have any questions on it? I can go through them itemized if you want, or if you have questions, it's up to you.
Can I just go back to the Nobody Field artificial turf replacement? How long have we had that out there? Do we know?
Let me get back there 1 second. Sorry. About
Yeah, it's the top one in the Public Works.
I would say,
Yeah, it's about 10 years.
I was gonna say
Ish.
10, yeah. Because one of the issues I believe we should check is how well have we maintained it? Have we been out there raking it and putting the stuff in and doing that or not?
Yes, we have. And we
Okay.
had over the summer, I think, a vendor came to assess its condition, and it was in good condition.
Okay. So we have maintained it. Okay.
We have. I will say that the DPW had previously entered into a 3-year contract for them to come out and review it and maintain it, and if there were necessary fill-ins or repairs to do that. So that has been a focus.
Because my understanding, you get longer than 10 years if you take care of it. So, maybe I hope we did. I hope we have all along. And if we haven't, I hope we do with the new one. So
the airport, some of the larger ones there, I guess I will take you through it, is they're looking to potentially construct a housing development at Nobody Farm, $5.1 million. Continued update to the paint and beads on the runways that used. Yep.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Is there a plan for that housing yet? And have they received FAA approvals?
So they have FAA approval.
Okay.
They've told us we're the first airport that they're aware of that's ever gotten permission to build housing. So, which is important. There's not a finalized plan. If you remember last year at the annual town meeting, they had approximately 1.1 million allocated for OPM and design.
Yeah.
I think that internally the airport is still kind of working through what that layout might look like and how they might use it. So there is not an actual layout or design at this point. They've talked about, before I think it was presented as potentially 2 duplexes. Now that I think, as most people are aware, they do have a house on the property that isn't heated, that they put a lot of their seasonal help in. They've now reconsidering maybe building a dormitory style on one side of the lot and then doing a duplex on the other so that they could upgrade and do that. So they're still in the process of refining what that layout looks like on the plot.
Where is the property? I'm not sure.
So my understanding is, where exactly is it? Because there's a large parcel
It's within the
sandwiched
Delta
between-
Fields, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, so the way they've presented it, the entrance to it would be off Nobody Road.
Yep.
Okay.
Nobody Farm.
Nobody Farm, yeah.
Nobody Farm Road, excuse me. But Capcom has asked them to consider coming off Sun Island into it, but it abuts the ball fields essentially in that
Sort
area,
of-
in that open parcel area near Park Circle.
Park Circle.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a small lot. I mean, there's a fairly large piece of property there. They're
Yes.
looking to use just a small
They're
portion of it.
looking to use a very small portion at this point. They've had preliminary discussions. They had a much larger schematic plan kind of layout done, but they've scaled it back to this smaller component at this point.
And it's housing just for airport staff.
It's housing for emergency staff directly related to the airport. I think there is they were going to go back and find out how far of an expansion they could have on that. But at this point, my understanding, it's airport emergency service directly related to airport operations.
So the question would be, would other island first responders be eligible as well for housing there under the FAA?
That is the question that they're still working on getting answered.
Okay, great, thank you.
and last year Capcom did not recommend it.
Right.
There was a lot of questions, and I was a little more for it, but it was just at the cost that it would be per square foot, and they just didn't recommend it.
Yeah, and I do think it would be interesting for them to coordinate with perhaps the Affordable Housing Trust on methods and so forth in terms of what we're doing and to keep costs down per unit. So.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. And I'll make sure to mention or suggest that they may want to reach out and talk to the Affordable Housing Trust.
The Park Circle was designed by David Howard, and he was a professor up at UNH. I'm not sure he's still around. He was friends with the Sanfords. So if you guys, and I think that they did a pretty good job there of making that a nice, dense community that works. It doesn't feel overrun, and you don't go speeding through it. So I think, sort of using some expertise like that would be helpful, I think. He had a preliminary plan for this property that we're on. it wasn't sort of embraced.
Timing.
So they have a supplemental funding for terminal improvements. This is what's known as an airport improvement project. This would be funded at a minimum of 90% by the federal government, 5% by the Commonwealth, and then they would be responsible for 5% cost. $5,040,000 for runway 24 high-speed exit. This relates to the flow and the occupancy time on the airport when planes land. I can't give you all the technical details, but I know that this is a high priority for them to get the airplanes as they land off the runway as quick as possible. The South Apron expansion, which is where they park all of the private jets and airplanes, they need to expand it because as they continue to get busier, they continue to run out of space and have to close runways to move planes around. So that project would anticipated to cost $22.6 million. Fencing on the perimeter road and relocation, I believe, is down towards Matacasham and Nobody Beach, excuse me. They have a plan in place if they need to relocate that fence, and they would like to have the funding in place in the event that they do need to relocate the fence line. EV charging infrastructure is $1.2 million. I'm probably not going to do this justice, but this relates to potentially putting in more electric vehicle charging stations, but also potentially charging stations for the future, which would all relate to electric planes. And as we've seen, Cape Air is invested in a company or is going to be working with a company to potentially get those certified to be able to fly. So the airport is trying to be proactive and have that plan in place in the event that they become certified to fly.
Hope those planes have backup engines.
Well, I'm thinking it's a good thing it's a short trip, so.
Yeah, hybrid.
So they need some money for exterior painting of the Jet A fuel tank, $96,000. They replace the airport, repaint the parking lot and luggage carts, $110,000. Now, it's important to note that some of these are grouped together. It's multiple projects that they put together. So it's not just luggage carts for $110,000. There's various other improvements that they've put together to come up with that $110,000. The tug to move aircraft, they need to replace that. That's projected to be $384,000. And then the ARF tools and equipment and PFAS decontamination, as they try to move to a foam that doesn't contain PFAS, they have to decontaminate all the equipment. So they requested $392,000 for that project.
Brian, just remind me of the AIP, all the big funds. It's we appropriate it, we approve it, but FAA usually covers 90% of it. We do 10.
Yes. So they actually, so we do appropriate the entire project so we can borrow for cash flow. When they get the grant proceeds in, then they use those to pay down the bands. But the way that funding for the AIP works is 90% federal government, typically 5% from Mass Aeronautics, and then 5% is our share. Okay. Now, some of these projects, depending on, even though they're ARP, some of them may have different funding structures just based on what the project is, because there's a lot of additional infrastructure money that is potentially being awarded to airports around the country. So. But that's the standard, the way that it goes is 95.5. And to that point, I will just make one note. The airport typically on their 5% never ends up borrowing it. They usually fund their 5% through retained earnings so that they don't end up having a long-term debt schedule related to a lot of their projects. Our Island Home. The only request that Island Home has this year is $175,000 for the purchase of a replacement van. Enterprise Fund. This is, we've broken this out a little differently this year. We have sewer and stormwater. We're focusing on working with stormwater, so we've kind of broken that out into its own identifiable category at the bottom. But for sewer, we're continuing the capacity maintenance, operation and maintenance plan that we have for $2 million annually, which is cameraing all the lines and using some of that funding for relining or replacement as necessary based on the outcome of the camera work, the CCTV work. This is supplemental funding is the next one for Surfside Wastewater Treatment Facility, the phase 2 upgrades, $7 million. We've already allocated approximately $9 million for this project. We have a preliminary scoping work that was done by Weston and Sampson, and this is on the intended use plan to be funded with through the SRF loan. So, but we need supplemental funding authorization to be able to proceed with the project based on the initial estimates from Weston and Sampson.
Brian, is that because it increased because of supply chain and inflation, or is it
It's
bigger scope?
I think it's a little bit bigger scope, and there was some timing, I don't say delays, but as we waited for the phase one upgrades to be fully implemented and be online and see how they worked out, there was some additional scoping work that was done. So I think it wasn't just supply chain. I think it's more timing of when the project was ready to come forward. Then the last request, they have a request for purchase of a replacement F-550 for $115,000, an electric admin vehicle for $50,000, and then a new F-350 pickup for $85,000. Stormwater, we've broken out. It has been a focus that we've tried to focus on in the last probably 12 months. And we have the Silver Street parking lot improvements, design and construction budgeted in for $1 million in fiscal 24's request. And then island-wide drainage improvements, we're requesting 1.1 million. And then in consultation with the sewer director, David Gray, who does a great job with CMOM, we are investigating, and as we will make the ultimate recommendation as we go through the investigation, to create a CMOM type program on the stormwater side. And we would request funding. $2 million has gone to Capcom for that as well.
Brian, on the stormwater, that's relatively new. Like 2 or 3 years ago and beyond, there was no funding for that at all, capital wise. Maybe here and there.
I think 3 years ago, I might have the exact time frame wrong. We allocated about $3.5 million to a debt exclusion as a starting point to do projects around the island. That's primarily exhausted, and this breaking it out and identifying it kind of is more putting a focus on it. And so those are the requests, and I think the CMOM part of that is really important. And that CMOM request really was born out of the fact that we're doing camera work in the Children's Beach area as part of that, the pump station replacement project. And that's the starting point. And I think it's important to continue that work around the island.
Matt?
Just going back to sewer and stormwater, whose request is Nantucket? You know, who's making that request?
Which one?
It's about a third of the total for this whole sheet.
Oh, in 2026?
25, 26, yeah, 5 million and then 47.4.
A lot of the additional needs areas are just placeholders to at least keep them in our mind. Because if we take them off, we'll forget, and then we don't want to add it 2 or 3 years later and surprise everybody with a $50 or $60 million project. So I don't know that there, and the town manager could probably answer this a little bit better. I'm not familiar with any big thrust to sewer Nantucket at this point, but it's been discussed, and we've put it as an out year project at this point.
It's been on there for years, right?
It has,
As an
yeah.
out year, yeah.
Yeah, but I think there's some work we need to do prior if we're going to do it. Because, and A is understanding what the difference of the build out and the hardscaping and everything else that would happen is, because we don't want to spend $50, $80 million and find that we're just as bad off.
Right.
So I think there's a lot we really need to figure out. So, I think Somerset, those areas, I think Somerset maybe on its own is something we should consider, but I don't think we should be going all the way to Nantucket till we get some stuff sorted.
Yeah, I had a conversation. Someone brought this up to me today. Why was there so much press about this? And I said, I really don't know, because we haven't pushed for moving this project forward, but it is just still in the queue.
That's why I'm asking, where's it coming from?
Yeah, I don't know why there was a big article about it.
Well, it's probably because of the study that was done of the build out. And so that brought it back up to the public's attention, even though David clearly stated in that meeting that it's not on the docket yet to sewer Nantucket. So, but it is, to me, it's an interesting conversation of the consequences of build out and as a result of sewering just across the island. And that was a very interesting meeting to me, and I'm curious of the analysis across Nantucket of what happens post sewering in terms of additional build out capacity. I think it's something we should pay attention to, not just in Nantucket.
Some of that, by the way, is in the sewer master plan, because we did do a build-out analysis as part of that in the needs areas where there would be sewering.
Next slide, please, Erica. Thank you. So Wanacomment and solid waste. Wanacomment has lead service replacement. This is DEP mandated to replace the lead pipes. They've requested for that project $1,175,000. Water tank recoating and replacement, $2,242,000. Pump station upgrades, which would be a new pump station at North Pasture. I'm sorry, this is for employee housing. I'm cut off here. Employee housing, which Mark would locate at the Pulpus Road site, is $2 million. That is anticipated to be a modular duplex. And he did go out and talk to some people to get a fairly solid quote at the $2 million for right now. Pipe and equipment storage building would be a steel building. This had been in an out year, but given the amount of inventory that they're carrying and the expensive nature of that inventory, we've brought it forward, and that's $950,000. Solid waste, the largest funding item request is a supplemental funding. If you remember previously, we allocated $14 million in a debt exclusion for the closing of the landfill closure for phase 1. That estimated cost, both from Waste Options and reviewed and agreed to by Weston and Sampson, places that cost at closer to $19 million right now. So we need a supplemental funding request in the amount of $5 million. They've requested a staff vehicle for $50,000, a third baler at the MRF for $380,000, transfer station, a second scale, which would cut down, hopefully cut down some of the wait time at the scale house, and also provide a second scale in the event of issues with one, so that we wouldn't have a slowdown or closures. It's $210,000, and then paving and stormwater improvements at the site is $500,000 has been requested. Preliminary request for enterprise fund, $71.5 million. Last year we were approved for the enterprise fund 32.4. A lot of this really large increase is made up of most of the airport projects, 22.7 for South Apron, $9 million for terminal expansion, Surfside is $7 million, nobody or farm housing of 5.1, and then supplemental funding for the landfill of $5 million. Town manager and I have very brief, next slide, thank you. Potential debt exclusions in 24. Last year we had a substantial number of them. The town manager and I have had briefly discussed it. Initially, when you go through this, if things were requested and recommended to go to town meeting, Surfside area roads reconstruction, that supplemental funding, we would most likely propose at a debt exclusion in the amount of 13 million. Landfill, the 5 million, we would also propose as a debt exclusion. Myacomet Pond, we're considering, or my initial discussions with the town manager was that potentially could be a debt exclusion depending on the participation of other parties involved in that. And then the Nobody soccer field expansion at 3.8 million also, if we move forward, may be a debt exclusion as well. Next slide, please. So out years, we're faced with substantial amount of debt exclusions potentially. Ireland Home for 50 million, potentially starting in fiscal 25 for the construction. This has been pushed out a little bit, but we will have to at some point kind of talk about the space needs for town administration and a municipal office building. That's projected to be 56 million. The intermodal transportation center, I'm not sure that we are actually going to do this, but if it was, it potentially could be a debt exclusion of 23 million. The auxiliary building, which is has come before town meeting or gone to Capcom a couple of times and not made it, and I think also was rejected at town meeting once. It's still a high priority for the police. It's a priority, excuse me, for the police and fire. The estimated cost right now is $5 million for that.
Brian?
Yes.
Is that also a facility that would house maintenance operations for vehicles?
It would, for police and fire, it would be set up to be able to do maintenance on the police and fire vehicles, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right,
And
thanks.
to get some of their other equipment outside into a structure.
And
Thanks.
it didn't pass town meeting at 3 million, right?
That's correct.
Now it's 5.
Now it's 5.
So if we think if we want it down the road, we can have it now for 5, or we can have it down the road for 10.
Well, I hope it doesn't get to 10, but
Well,
I know.
that's how things go.
So in my opinion, I think this is an example of something that perhaps wasn't as clearly explained as to what it was. I think sometimes when we have multiple big capital projects, sometimes we highlight some more than others in terms of explaining what they are. I can tell you, when I went to vote on it, I don't think I completely understood that it was about maintenance as well, you know.
I think it
maintenance
ended
operations.
up like this too, partially because if I remember correctly, when we went back for supplemental funding for the fire station, this was it was a fairly substantial cost, and I think it was decided to move it out at that point.
Yeah.
But it's something that I think the police and fire still think is necessary to advance their operations at some point.
Thanks.
And we talk about this at Capcom a lot. I think we've always recommended it. I think we need it. If you look at the longevity of the vehicles, that it extends over years, like having them inside, and then you got the maintenance. So people who don't want it can easily say, "Oh, $3 million shed, $5 million shed. Why do we need a shed?" And we need to explain it better.
New senior center at some point during the phasing of the Island Home construction, $30 million. We're still working on a location for the potential for a new public works campus. That's projected at 18 million. Sconset Fire Station, 7.8 million. And implementation of the recommendations in the Parks Master Plan, exclusive of the 3.8 million in this year, would be 22.5 million. And the school has put a placeholder in for fiscal 32, potentially of a new middle school, and the number that they're using is 50 million. So the out year potential large-scale construction projects that we would potentially propose as debt exclusions is $262,350,000, excuse me. Next slide, please, Erica, if there's no
Am
questions.
I allowed to say that's kind of frightening?
You certainly.
Okay, that is a frightening number. Our budget went up like 8% or something this past year, and a lot of that was just the 5 million from from Island Home. So this is scary to me. But anyway.
So as we work through this and some unknowns that potentially could have impact on the capital improvement plan, what the comprehensive plan for any necessary relocation of Baxter Road will certainly impact our capital project plan in some way, shape, or form at some point. As you all are aware, we've allocated about 2.7 million for dealing with PFAS. The actual scope of that remediation is still an unknown, so that is something that would have a potential large-scale impact on us on a go-forward basis. As I mentioned, with the potential out-year debt exclusions, we're still working through the decision whether we leave the DPW campus in Nantucket Road or whether we relocate it, and if we relocate it, what does that look like and where? We have not put a lot of the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee recommendations have not fully been factored into this plan, and that list is very extensive and very costly. So those will have an impact as we move forward with those, or any potential for those. And then Park and Rec's master plan. The unknown here really is any unknowns relative to any revisions due to coastal resiliency and any of the other island projects that we're working on. Any questions on that? Okay. So the next steps, continue to work with not only Sue, but with the town manager on the recommendation for funding sources. This will become a little bit clearer by the end of October when we do have free cash certified, at least for the general fund. It'll be a little clearer, and also for some of the enterprise funds with retained earnings. We're still working with completing the capital program reviews, the RORIs, and our recommendations to the Capcom to review simultaneously together once they're all completed. And then continuing review with the select board and the FinCom to review the ultimate Capcom program committee's recommendations. And I'm certainly available for any questions now from the board that we didn't address during the presentation, or you can certainly email us, and we're certainly happy to provide the answers.
Just one comment, Brian, that I always try to say each year is similar to what we're hearing from the audit and the overall financial strength. that you and your team brought together. So is Capcom. It's you and Rick Sears and Stephen Welch. Is really, when I got on Capcom my first year in select board, so 5 years ago, we weren't looking out, we weren't looking back. Not like we are now, like really looking out over 5 or 10 years. And like what you said, Brian, of going to the department heads and saying, okay, what last year, the last couple of years, what have you not spent on? That's really helpful for Capcom to look at. And so just a couple of really good points, that things that weren't happening 4 or 5 years ago.
And I just would like to note, I mean, this presentation and a lot of work over the last 3 weeks has been done by Sue, and she's done a tremendous job putting this together and taking the work that Rick had accomplished and strengthening it and improving this process. So I do want to say thank you to her too as well.
Thank you, Sue. Any questions for Brian?
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you, Sue,
Thank you.
and thank you to Rick and others who have worked on this. We have had a lot of turnover in the finance department with people who worked on capital, so it's a little remarkable that it hasn't improved as much as it has, but thank you to everybody who's been involved. Okay, monthly town manager report. So again, I won't go through every single item, but I want to give you some highlights about what we've most recently been working on. I wanted to mention that Greg recently went to the 2022 ICMA annual conference. It was in Columbus, Ohio this year. And he came back with a lot of really great information and some consistent themes. He went to a lot of sessions and talked to a lot of people, and his takeaways were, he said, just sort of consistent with Nantucket struggles. He gave me a little report about it. I'm just going to give you some highlights of it. Affordable housing, an issue everywhere. Recruiting and retention, a crisis is mounting everywhere. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The great retirement, government service is no longer attractive. There's ugly civil discourse, low wages, boring work, etc. Wages and fringe benefits aren't enough. Housing costs, or just government wages, are significant barriers. Remote work becoming more mainstream, I guess. Government has become ugly. Lack of civility nationwide. Tone and tenor of society has changed, making government service more unattractive. Things like that. Government service needs to pivot. We all know government moves like at the pace of, I'm sure there's a saying, I can't remember what it is right now. Molasses, thank you. It's like turning a battleship, as Weddy Willauer used to say. And there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't move quickly, and it's not, it doesn't pivot well. He went to a ton of sessions, a lot of strategic planning, some DEI, facilities management, core services, leadership development. His other takeaways were, it was great to hear from other managers. No, we're not alone. Government service is more challenging. That's not going to change anytime soon. Nantucket is doing very well in many areas, including strategic planning, public outreach, fiscal management, cybersecurity, DEI, resiliency and sustainability. We're behind in housing, staffing and retention, facility management, professional development, all things that we are working on improving. So thank you, Greg, for that report. In other projects and activities, we're working on still a little bit on the 2022 annual town meeting follow-up. The bylaws, while most of them have been approved by the Attorney General, there are 2 outstanding. One is actually Article 39, which is the short-term rental authorization. However, the only thing outstanding there is something to do with the penalty. It's still under review. And Article 71, the so-called topless beach article, has not been approved yet. As we know, the board adopted the Board of Health and Select Board adopted short-term regulations. Those are getting advertised, I think, this week, maybe next, I forget, but very shortly. And the work group is in progress. I think the work group is meeting next week. Or the 11th, thank you. And I asked the facilitator today or yesterday when a good time might be to come give an update, perhaps before the citizen warrant article deadline. And that might have been late today, I think. So I'll hear back from her shortly. 2023 annual town meeting preparation. I just started putting together a preliminary outline of warrant articles yesterday. That'll be on your agenda next week. The fiscal 24 budget prep is underway. We have a lot of meetings scheduled this month with departments and also into November, with the intent to get you all the budget recommendations by, I think, December 14th. And as you know, a ton of work goes into the budget prep. Climate action, sustainability. We had funding approved for a sustainability position in the fiscal 23 budget. A position description has been developed, and it's under the final stages of being reviewed with the union and hopefully getting advertised very shortly. Baxter Road long-term planning, as you know, is ongoing. We have an update scheduled for the board at your October 19th meeting. I think it says October 5th in the report, but it's really October 19th. We have monthly staff meetings on this. We had a summer forum in August. Related to that, sort of, is the SBPF erosion control project, and obviously we're spending a lot of staff time on that as well. We've spent some time recently on the proposed solar project at 1 Milestone Road, the Wannacomet property, and you have some executive session discussion tomorrow on that. Nantucket Sewer, I just wanted to mention that, as Brooke was saying, it sort of popped up again, but it isn't something that staff is spending a lot of time on, and there are a couple of main reasons for that. One is that the build out was a concern, but the other is that we were trying to figure out how to reconcile some coastal resiliency recommendations that involve raising sections of Nantucket Road and whether or not that could coincide with the sewer. And what we learned is it doesn't have to coincide with the sewer, and there was also an issue with culverts, but should it? And would that just be a massive project to be done all at once? And it was sounding more and more complicated. Also, the TMDLs for Nantucket watersheds, estuaries were improving. So we were going to focus on some other areas like Somerset Needs area. So that's underway with internal staff planning.
And just from the coastal resiliency standpoint, Nantucket is threatened, and it's frightening when you look at the low-lying areas and what could happen there. So as a community, we should be really thinking long and hard about whether we want to, I always say the first step of retreat is to not go forward. If we build and make a lot more out there, we're just making a bigger headache for ourselves to solve later. So we really should be thinking about that, especially when you look at the maps. And I know people might not want to hear that, but it's evident when you look at those maps that we have to really think about it differently than we have. Sorry.
No, thank you, Matt. That's helpful. We have a joint meeting scheduled with Vineyard Select Boards on October 18th at 4, I believe it is. And I put together a list of potential items for that meeting, and they've been giving some input, and we've been sort of trading that back and forth, and there's been some communication this week about that. There is a new marijuana law, which Town Council has sent out an advisory to its clients on that. I'm still kind of going through it, but the bottom line is that at some point, if not sooner rather than later, the host community agreements and associated host community benefit payments, they're called something, I can't remember what they're called right now, are probably not going to be able to continue. The tax will continue, but these payments will most likely not. So we're trying to sort out when that will sort of get underway. Solid waste long-term planning is ongoing. We have monthly meetings, which now include a select board member and a finance committee member. We have funding for a solid waste manager position in our current year budget, and that is out for being advertised, or will be shortly after union review. Our recycling coordinator has resigned. We're holding off on filling that position until the solid waste manager position is hopefully filled. The strategic plan, as you know, we're starting to prep for November workshop on November 14th. PFAS ongoing. Stormwater drainage issues. We have a lot of activity with stormwater and drainage issues, and not to go into all of it, because I'll probably give you another update about it in November, but we had an engineer go around to the areas that we get the most complaints about. There are about 18 of them, and there's probably more, but these are the 18 they focused on. And we had them develop a cost estimate and what could be done about them. The cost estimate came in at something like $3 million. I have it somewhere here, for these 18 locations. And We think we may be able to get at some of them. They've been prioritized, and we may be able to get some of them in this fiscal year, $3.6 million. So I think Brian mentioned these in his, in the report here, but we'll try to get to some of them this fiscal year because there is a little bit of money available. But this is a growing issue, and they made some comments when they were doing this assessment and this review, and this will be no surprise to you, but the summary of issues, these things just aren't easy to fix. So when people complain about stormwater and drainage in their driveway or roadway near them, just come fix it, just clean out the catch basin. Sometimes there is no catch basin, or there are issues because the catch basins admittedly have not been extremely well maintained, and they aren't extremely well maintained in most towns. But connectivity issues, undersized systems adjacent to dirt roads, lack of outlet piping, lack of available records, maintenance and general upkeep, paving and grading issues, enforcement issues, nearby construction is a problem, erosion issues, stabilization and seeding of side slopes. So there's a lot of factors that go into stormwater problems. So we're trying to get at how we are going to deal with all of that.
Libby, will some of that, if it does pass a debt exclusion with the CMOM, because we haven't really mapped all our stormwater,
Right.
so we could really start mapping it, and
Yes,
seeing
absolutely.
how Lily Pond
Yep,
drains
that-
into the harbor and
Yep,
things like
how
that.
Children's Beach and all of
What's the
that.
status of the pump down on Brant Point? I know that was kind of put off to do some more
You mean
work
Children's
on.
Beach?
Yeah, Children's Beach.
That area?
Yeah.
Well, there's like a winter pump, or a storm pump that gets down there as needed. But we have a study underway right now, which is an assessment of the infrastructure in that entire area. That's basically what that is. We did have a report that recommended the installation of a larger pump kind of near where the bandstand. The greatest spot for something like that, given the projections, sea level rise. So that's part of what this study will do eventually. How can this area be?
Where, the issues are. So I think that's another thing that's going to be an interesting community outreach piece is
Yeah,
understanding what is and isn't
Yep.
the town's responsibility.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing some of that.
And I would add one more thing onto that, Brooke, is people who know they're on a private road, but also think the town has certain responsibilities for it. Yeah, and just are a little confused.
And wants the town to take it and pay for it. And I always say,
Right.
why don't you fix everything? Let us your community, why does your neighborhood fix everything, and then we'll take it. And I get a lot of people don't like hearing that, but
Well, and the other piece is that some private developments were not done at a high quality too, so they're failing over time. So,
yes.
And, some are older, so they didn't have the homeowners association structure that you would see today. Personnel, lots of activity in HR. We're working to hire key positions that were just approved at this past town meeting. Our compensation and classification study is underway. One of the holdups on that is that we asked a variety of comparable towns for information, and they are slow at getting it back to us. Towns are notoriously slow at doing that. I admit, if I see something from another town, I try to bring it up to the top, but sometimes it looks like a long thing to answer, and it doesn't get to the top. Succession planning and long-term retention strategies. We're having a lot of internal discussions about that. Collective bargaining is about to start, as you know, and prep is underway for contracts that will expire.
Libby, if I can jump in, the succession planning you've done, you're not completely all the way through, but you've done a
No.
substantial amount.
We have a
that-
draft report from our consultant, and what we need to do now is work with each department head as to how we're going to implement it. What sort of, they may need budgetary money for training, classes, certifications, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So collective bargaining, as we said, is underway. We have a joint executive session scheduled with school committee, water, airport, and the board on, I think, sometime middle of this month. Our new chief is here, as we know. Thank you, Mike, for being here. We had the meet and greet yesterday with him. Our assistant finance director is hired. We have about 27 vacancies right now townwide, excluding school, airport, and water, and new positions for fiscal '23. Project management is always a discussion that we're having. We're trying to figure out a project management position. We're also having a number of projects handled by outside firms, including the ones that are shown on the screen, but that it's not on the screen right now. But those include Pleasant Street, Silver Domain, Pleasant Street, Williams to the Mid-Island Roundabout, the Somerset Raceway project I mentioned earlier, Millie's Bridge, Newtown Road has been lingering for a while. We're trying to get back to it. Lots of projects. Central Fleet Management is a project that we kicked off today with our consultant, Weston and Sampson. They're going to do a townwide review of how the town handles its fleet management. And so that's going to be underway. Our DEI assessment you heard about last week, we finally submitted our WRAP funding application. WRAP means Winter Relief Assistance, Winter Recovery Assistance Program. That was something new last year that the state allowed. Every town got an allocation for winter road repairs and recovery because last winter was so terrible. We received $411,000. So we have a list of areas that we're going to be getting around to patching, hopefully in a permanent sort of a way. Housing, lots of activity under housing. Just some of the things that we're working on. We have about a monthly staff meeting. Tucker is on it. We met today. We're talking about our $1 million town employee housing assistance pilot program. And every time we meet about it, it seems like something new comes up that is just more challenging than the thing that just came up. So we're really trying to sort through that.
It hasn't really been done before, kind of like some of the other bond
Exactly.
issues with housing. It's
Yeah.
not been done, and we have to,
It's just complicated. And sometimes we think, well, why don't we just give everybody a flat amount? Like this is something that I think the hospital may have looked at. But then we think, well, that just, it shouldn't really work like that. It should go to the people that have the most need. So we're constantly not arguing with each other, but we go back to the same argument over and over. We're working on planning how the town's going to manage and maintain its own housing stock. We do have some units that have come online very recently, and now we need to maintain them and figure out how to manage them. We're looking at planning for housing along Waite Drive, seasonal and year-round, and Tacoma. We have some town-owned lots along there. We're always looking for seasonal housing and to try to get that lined up just in case we really need it. We did very well this past year, but there's always a fear that something's going to happen. We need to have it secured. And we have several rented units right now that we're always shuffling people around in them. A lot of travel nurses for Island Home and others. So we're looking at also renting additional private residences or multi-unit housing. So we had a discussion today about one of them. And that probably will be before you in the form of a lease fairly soon. So those are the highlights.
any comments from anybody?
Just thank you.
Okay, any select board comments or committee reports, Brooke?
I wanted to note that the Affordable Housing Trust closed on a property recently, and it is occupied by first responders who will remain there, be able to remain there. So it was kind of an interesting acquisition for the trust. And we are working on development planning and requests for proposals for the properties at Orange Street, Bartlett Road, and Amelia Drive. So the community is going to start seeing progress on the development side for those properties. So in line with our plan to remain in safe harbor until we arrive at the required 10% number with the state.
Thank you, Brooke. Don?
Oh, just, we're at the time of year where the CPC applications have all come in, and we have around 2.3 million in requests. So we'll be starting review of all of those. But what did strike me is that there were no open space requests. And I hope that maybe we think about something that we could do for open space, like potentially a playground that goes along with Tacoma Green for next year.
So 2.3 in request, how much do you have to fund?
I need to get the exact answer to
Yeah.
that.
Is it usually that amount, or
It's
is it
usually,
much
it
lower?
is usually around that, but
Okay.
there are certain bonds that we have
Right.
to pay, and then there's the different allocations. So we'll be going through all of that.
Great. Matt, anything from you? Okay. All right, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, that passes. Thank you all.
Really fast.
Am I done? I did it. I'm done.
Yeah.
I have a quick signature.
Libby, I hope you don't think I was rude signing while you were talking.
I didn't want to.
I can focus.
I was listening.
Yeah.